The desert night was quiet, but not the kind of quiet that gave peace. It was the sort of silence that pressed down heavy, like a weight on the chest, broken only by the crackle of firewood and the distant call of a coyote. The old cowboy leaned back against the cave wall, his hat tilted low, his breath slow but strained. His body ached from years of hard riding, gunfights, and lonesome nights spent under endless skies. He thought he had left most troubles behind him, that the world had nothing new to throw his way. But trouble, as he'd learned long ago, had a way of finding a man whether he wanted it or not. She had stumbled into his life like a storm wild, stubborn and far too fearless for her own good. Her dress was torn at the hem, dust smeared across her arms and cheeks, yet her eyes carried a fire that dared him to look away. He'd seen that kind of fire before, in men who thought they couldn't be beaten, in women who believed the frontier would bend to their will. But this was different. There was something about her gaze that cut straight through the armor he'd built over a lifetime of keeping folks at a distance. She wasn't asking for permission. She wasn't even asking for help. She was demanding to be seen, and that was dangerous for a man who'd lived by keeping his heart shut tight. When she spoke, her voice was steady, though her hands trembled just slightly as she pressed them against the ground to sit straighter. "I'm not a little girl," she said, each word sharp enough to echo against the cave walls. For a moment, he didn't answer. He only stared at the fire, at the sparks that leapt upward and disappeared into the darkness. He wasn't the kind of man who took to speeches. Words in his world carried less weight than action. But hearing her say that, in the middle of nowhere with danger pressing on both sides, stirred something inside him he hadn't felt in years. The firelight painted her face in gold and shadow, making her look both fierce and fragile at once. He saw the scratch along her collarbone, the dirt on her knees, the stubborn set of her jaw. She wasn't a child, not by any measure, and yet the world would chew her up all the same if she went on believing she could fight it alone. That's what he wanted to tell her, but he couldn't, not now. Not with the night alive with unseen threats and the weight of her eyes fixed on him like he was the last man on earth capable of standing between her and whatever waited out there in the dark. He shifted, the leather of his coat creaking as he adjusted the rifle by his side. His bones ached, and his spirit felt even older. "Maybe not," he muttered, almost to himself. "But the world don't care what you think you are." She tilted her head, studying him, trying to read the scars written across his face, the wear in his voice. He had the look of a man who'd seen too much, but still carried the burden of staying alive when others hadn't. That kind of weight had a way of changing a man, of making him cold. Yet sitting so close to him now, she could feel something beneath that gruff silence, something human he fought to keep buried. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the smell of smoke. Her eyes darted toward the cave entrance, then back to him. "They're still out there, aren't they?" she asked, her voice lower now, almost a whisper. He didn't answer right away. He reached for his canteen, took a slow sip, and then nodded. "Men like that don't quit easy," he said. "They'll circle round, wait for the right moment." The words fell heavy between them, making the firelight seem smaller, weaker against the dark. She pulled her knees up to her chest, resting her chin on them. For all her defiance, he could see the worry creeping in now, the quiet fear she tried so hard to hide. She reminded him of himself long ago, before time had sanded down the edges of his anger, before he learned how cruel and unforgiving the frontier could be. He wanted to tell her to run, to save herself while she still had the chance. But he knew she wouldn't. She was too stubborn, too proud. And part of him, though he hated to admit it, was glad she wouldn't. It had been a long time since he'd had someone beside him, even if it was just for one dangerous night. The flames flickered, throwing their shadows long against the stone walls. She shifted closer, not out of fear, but something else, something unspoken. He felt the warmth of her shoulder brushing against his arm, the tremor in her breath as she steadied herself. "You could have left me back there," she said softly. "But you didn't. Why?" He didn't answer, not directly. Instead, he pulled the brim of his hat lower and let the silence stretch. Because the truth was, he didn't know why. Maybe it was her voice, or the way she stood her ground even when the odds were stacked against her. Maybe it was the way she reminded him that he hadn't always been this hardened, this tired. Or maybe it was just that she looked at him like he was still worth something, and he couldn't remember the last time anyone had. The crack of a branch outside made them both freeze. His hand tightened around the rifle, his eyes narrowing toward the cave mouth. She didn't move, but he felt her tense, every muscle coiled like a spring. The fire hissed as a log shifted, sending sparks into the air. The cowboy raised a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. Whoever was out there, they were close. Too close. The girl's breath hitched, but she didn't speak. She pressed her shoulder against his, as if bracing herself for whatever was coming. The old cowboy's heart thudded like a war drum in his chest. He thought he'd left this kind of life behind, the nights spent waiting for men who hunted him, the moments when a single wrong move meant the end. But here he was again, pulled back into the old ways, with a girl who refused to back down and danger pressing in on every side. He told himself he didn't care what happened to her, that she wasn't his responsibility. Yet as the shadows shifted outside and the sound of boots scraped against stone, he knew deep down that wasn't true. He couldn't turn away, not now. Not from her dot. She leaned in, her whisper barely more than a breath. "What do we do?" He didn't answer. Not yet. The cave held its breath along with them, the fire crackling low, the darkness thickening. The cowboy's hand hovered over his rifle, his eyes fixed on the black mouth of the cave. Somewhere out there death waited. And though he'd long made peace with meeting it, tonight felt different. Tonight he had something to lose. The sound came again, louder this time. A figure moved just beyond the fire's reach. His grip tightened. The girl's eyes widened. The moment stretched, sharp as a drawn blade. And then the figure shifted again in the dark, just enough to send a shadow gliding across the cave floor. The cowboy's heart slowed into that strange rhythm he only felt when danger pressed close. His finger hovered near the trigger, every muscle tight, but he did not fire. Not yet. He had lived too long on the edge of life and death to waste a bullet on a trick of the firelight. The girl pressed closer, her breath brushing his arm. She didn't flinch, though. For all her youth, she had a steel that reminded him of the wild horses that once roamed these lands, untamed and proud. The silence stretched. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of hooves and the creak of leather. He knew that sound too well. Men on horseback, circling, waiting. They weren't the kind to give up. He could almost see their eyes out there in the night, hungry for whatever prize they thought they'd get. Maybe it was money. Maybe revenge. Or maybe just the cruel sport of chasing down the weak. Whatever it was, they would not ride away without trying to take it. The girl spoke again, her voice steady but low. "Why are they after you?" The cowboy kept his eyes on the mouth of the cave. He did not answer right away. His past wasn't a story to be told in the flicker of one fire. But she was looking for something, maybe a reason to trust him, maybe just a scrap of truth to hold on to. He finally said, "I crossed men who don't forget. And they ain't the forgiving kind." Her eyes studied him, searching for the rest of the tale, but he gave her nothing more. She had her secrets, too. He could see it in the way she held herself, in the way her chin lifted whenever she spoke. She wanted to prove herself, to show she could stand in the same world as him, but he wondered if she knew what that really meant. The frontier wasn't a place for pride or innocence. It was a place that swallowed both and left only scars behind. He thought back to the town they'd left behind. that dusty cluster of buildings where everything had started just 2 nights ago. The saloon had been alive with smoke and music, a piano clanging in the corner while men shouted over their cards. He had only gone in for a drink, nothing more. But that was where he first saw her, standing near the bar with her back straight and eyes sharp. She didn't belong there, not in a place where men weighed every woman with the same hungry stare. Yet she stood tall, daring anyone to tell her otherwise. He had watched her then, curious in spite of himself, wondering what kind of fire drove her into a place like that alone. He hadn't expected to see her again, not after she walked out into the night with her head held high. But fate had a way of crossing paths where you least expected. By morning, she was on the run, and so was he. And whether she liked it or not, their trails had tangled together. Back in the cave, the firelight danced across her face as she leaned closer, her voice lower now. "You could leave me here. They're after you, not me." He let out a breath, half a laugh without humor. "Don't be so sure," he said. "Men like that don't care who gets caught in the middle. You were with me." "That's enough," she frowned, as if testing his words against her own sense of the world. Then she shook her head. "I'm not afraid of them." The cowboy turned to look at her for the first time since the shadow had stirred outside. Her eyes met his, clear and unyielding. It struck him harder than he expected, that kind of fearless honesty. But he also knew fear when it was buried under pride. He had seen it in too many faces before. The real question wasn't whether she was afraid. It was whether she could survive what was coming. The sound outside grew fainter, but he knew better than to believe they were gone. Men like that were patient. They would wait until the fire died low and fatigue settled heavy. That was when they would strike. He adjusted the rifle across his lap, the steel cold against his calloused hands. The girl's gaze lingered on the weapon, then on the scars along his knuckles, and finally back to his face. She opened her mouth as if to speak again, but closed it. Holding the words inside, he didn't press her. He had learned long ago that folks revealed themselves in their own time, not when you forced them. Still, he wondered who she truly was and what had brought her to this moment beside him in a cave with death waiting outside. She wasn't just some runaway. She carried herself like someone with a purpose. Though she tried to mask it behind stubborn defiance, the fire popped, breaking the silence, and for a moment, both of them looked toward the flames as if they offered answers. The cowboy shifted, pulling his coat tighter around his shoulders. He remembered nights long ago, sitting just like this, when he still believed he could outrun his past. He thought he had buried the man he used to be, the outlaw, the gunslinger, the restless soul with too much blood on his hands. But every time he looked at her, he felt the old pieces stirring again, the part of him that refused to walk away when someone needed him. The girl finally spoke again, her tone softer this time. "You don't trust me, do you?" He glanced at her, then back toward the dark beyond the cave. "Trust is a luxury out here, and luxuries get you killed." She studied him for a long moment before saying, "Maybe, but you didn't leave me behind." That counts for something. Her words hung in the air, heavier than he wanted them to be. He told himself she was just another stranger crossing his path, that when this was over, they would part ways and never look back. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. The frontier didn't just throw people together without reason. Every encounter left a mark, and he had a feeling this one would cut deeper than most the wind picked up outside, howling through the rocks, carrying with it the scent of dust and smoke. He tightened his grip on the rifle and stared into the darkness, every sense sharpened. The girl stayed close, silent now, but her presence was steady, grounding in its own way. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't entirely alone in facing the night. Somewhere out there, beyond the firelight, boots scraped again against stone. He could almost hear the whispers of men waiting, plotting. His jaw tightened. He had lived his life knowing danger was never far behind, but tonight the weight of it felt different. Tonight, it wasn't just his life on the line. And though he told himself he didn't care, he knew that was a lie. The girl leaned her head back against the stone wall, her eyes half closed but still alert. "They won't stop, will they?" she asked quietly. "No," he said. "Not until they get what they came for." She nodded slowly, as if she already knew the answer but needed to hear it spoken aloud. The fire burned lower, shadows creeping longer across the walls. The cowboy adjusted his hat, pulled it low, and let the silence stretch again. He didn't know how long the night would last or what waited when dawn finally broke. But he knew one thing for certain. The fight wasn't over. Not for him. Not for her. Not yet. And as the darkness outside shifted once more, and a figure lingered just beyond the reach of the flames, he understood that the night was only beginning, and the storm they were caught in had far more to reveal. The figure beyond the fire moved again, slow and deliberate, as if testing how close he could creep before being noticed. The cowboy shifted, tilting the barrel of his rifle just slightly, enough that the girl caught the movement out of the corner of her eye. She held her breath, her body stiff against the stone wall. The air in the cave felt tight, pressed down with the weight of what was about to happen. For a moment, nothing followed. The shadow retreated back into the dark, leaving only the sound of wind against the rocks. It was almost worse than an attack. The waiting gnawed at the nerves, drawing every second out longer than it should be. The cowboy had seen this kind of game before. Men who hunted others sometimes preferred fear to bullets. Let them stew. Let them wonder when the shot would come. Fear could break a person faster than pain if you gave it enough time. He knew that trick, and he hated it. He pulled the rifle tighter across his lap and muttered, "They want us tired. They'll wait until the fire dies, then push in." The girl looked at him sharply. "So we just sit here?" she whispered. He shook his head. "We wait. There's a difference." His voice was calm, but inside his mind was already working through the choices. They could try to ride out before dawn, but with men waiting in the rocks it would be suicide. They could fight, but that would mean putting her in the middle of it. Or they could wait until the men outside made their move and hope to outlast them. None of the choices were good. Her hands fidgeted against the torn fabric of her dress, twisting the loose thread at her sleeve. She tried to still them, but her nerves betrayed her. He saw it, though he said nothing. She was holding on to her pride, but fear had begun to slip through the cracks. Finally, she spoke again. "This isn't just about you, is it? They're not chasing only because of something you did." The cowboy turned his gaze on her. She didn't look away this time. The firelight caught her eyes, making them shine with a mix of fear and stubbornness. "What do you know?" he asked flatly. She hesitated, chewing her lip before answering. "I know they looked at me when they rode into town. The way they looked, it wasn't about you alone." That piece of truth hit him harder than he let show. He had been so sure this was his past finally catching up. But maybe she had her own hunters, men who carried grudges or worse. He thought back to that saloon, the way she stood out among the smoke and noise. Maybe she hadn't been running toward anything at all. Maybe she was running from someone. The fire crackled low as he leaned back against the wall again, staring at her with new weight in his eyes. "You gonna tell me the whole of it?" She crossed her arms, drawing herself inward. "Not tonight," she said softly. He almost pressed her, but he let it go. Everyone carried secrets. Some were too heavy to spill in the middle of a night like this. The sounds outside quieted for a while, but the cowboy knew better than to think the danger had passed. He could feel it lingering, like a rattlesnake waiting in tall grass. Still, the pause gave his mind time to wander back through the paths that had led him here. He remembered the faces of men he once called brothers, men who had died in ambushes, shootouts, and noose ropes. He remembered the woman he left behind years ago, her voice telling him he'd never find peace if he kept living by the gun. She was right, but it was too late now. The frontier had already carved its mark into him. The girl shifted beside him, breaking his thoughts. "Do you regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Regret what?" he asked back. Living this way, running, fighting. Her question lingered, heavy in the cave. He finally answered, "Regret don't change a thing. A man makes his choices and then he carries them. That's all." She seemed unsatisfied by that, but she didn't argue. Instead, she turned her eyes toward the flames, her mind somewhere far away. He watched her for a moment longer, noticing how the firelight softened her features, making her look younger, almost fragile. Then the wind carried a new sound, distant at first, then sharper. A whistle. Not a bird, not the wind. A signal. The cowboy straightened, his hand tightening on the rifle. The girl's eyes snapped to him. "What is it?" He didn't answer. He just tilted his head toward the cave entrance. Another whistle followed, closer this time, answered by the faint jingle of spurs. They were closing in. He motioned for her to stay low, and she obeyed, pressing herself against the stone wall. The tension in the cave thickened until every heartbeat felt loud. The cowboy's thoughts raced through strategy, through the angles of the cave and the range of his rifle. He could drop the first man who came through, but after that the odds would be against them. And yet, a small part of him burned with something old and familiar, the spark of battle, the test of survival. He had lived so long in the shadow of death that facing it almost felt like home. But this time wasn't the same. This time he wasn't alone. As the footsteps drew nearer, he thought about what she had said. That they looked at her in town. That this fight wasn't just his. The realization unsettled him more than the danger itself. Whoever was out there wanted more than his blood. And that meant the girl's secrets mattered more than she let on. The first shadow appeared in the cave mouth, faint against the dying fire. The cowboy raised his rifle slowly, steady as stone. His finger brushed the trigger, but he didn't pull. Not yet. The figure hesitated, then stepped back into the dark. Testing again. Waiting. The girl leaned close, her whisper barely audible. "Why don't they come in?" His jaw tightened. "Because they're deciding if we're worth the risk. Men like that don't rush unless they're sure." She frowned, her eyes darting to the shadows. "So what do we do?" He looked at her, at the stubborn fire in her eyes despite the fear. "We hold." The night dragged on, every sound magnified, every moment stretched. He knew dawn was still hours away, but already the weight of fatigue pressed on him. He couldn't let it show, though. She needed him steady, and the truth was, he needed her steady too. Outside, the wind carried the faint murmur of voices. Too soft to make out, but close enough to confirm his fear. They weren't just waiting. They were planning. The cowboy's chest tightened with an old, familiar ache. He had faced death more times than he could count, but never like this, with someone depending on him who refused to admit she needed saving. The fire sputtered low, shadows swallowing the cave walls. The girl hugged her knees tighter, her eyes fixed on the dark ahead. Somewhere in that blackness, the men closed in, their boots whispering against stone, their whispers sharp with intent. The cowboy gripped his rifle and drew in a slow breath, knowing the storm was about to break. He had no illusions of an easy fight. But he also knew one thing. No matter what secrets she held, no matter what past he carried, tonight neither of them could run. Tonight they would stand, side by side, against whatever stepped out of the dark, and as the first ember of dawn brushed the edge of the horizon, the night held its breath, waiting for the moment when silence would finally shatter. The night stretched thin, and every sound outside the cave felt sharpened, heavy with meaning. The cowboy's eyes never left the mouth of the cave, the fire now little more than glowing coals. He could feel the girl's quiet breaths at his side, steady but tense. The whispers beyond the rock had grown clearer, voices low but certain, men mapping out how they'd come in, how they'd split, how they'd flush the two of them out. He'd heard it all before, men dividing the kill before they had it in their hands. His grip tightened on the rifle, his thumb brushing the cold steel. He told himself to wait, to measure the moment, but the silence pressed harder with each heartbeat. He could see in her eyes that she was caught between fear and defiance, her jaw set, her hands clenched though she had no weapon of her own. She looked younger in the dim light, yet older at the same time, carrying something on her shoulders that no girl her age should bear. One of the voices outside barked a short command, and the scuff of boots on stone followed. The cowboy shifted, leaning forward. His breath slowed to the rhythm he'd learned long ago, the calm before the gunfire. He knew once it began there'd be no stopping it. Every choice after the first shot would be written in blood. The girl leaned toward him, her whisper barely audible. "We can't stay here. They'll trap us." He glanced at her, his eyes hard but steady. "They're already trapping us," he said. She swallowed, pressing her lips together, but didn't argue. She was right, though. Staying meant dying slow. Running meant dying fast. Either way, death had them by the throat. The cowboy's thoughts slipped back to a memory that came unbidden. A night much like this 1 year ago. A canyon, a fire, men creeping closer. Back then he had been younger, reckless, ready to meet death head-on just to prove he wasn't afraid. That night ended in bodies scattered in the dirt, and the silence that followed still clung to him like smoke. He wondered if tonight would end the same, only this time he wouldn't be the only one paying the price. The sound of steel scraped faintly against rock outside the cave. A knife, maybe, or the edge of a rifle barrel. He raised his own rifle and trained it on the dark opening. His finger brushed the trigger, steady but itching. The girl shifted against the wall, her breathing sharp, but her eyes locked on the same place as his dot. Then came the whistle again, sharp and low. Another answered it from farther off. They were spread wide, surrounding the cave mouth, closing the circle. The cowboy's jaw tightened. He had fought odds before, but this felt different. These men weren't careless. They knew patience, and patience made them dangerous. The girl's voice trembled, though she tried to keep it strong. "Why don't they just come in? Why wait?" He kept his eyes on the dark. "Because they want us scared. They want us broken before they fire the first shot." She shivered, then lifted her chin. "Then don't give them that." Her words stirred something in him, something he thought long buried. He looked at her fully for the first time since the night began, really looked. She wasn't just clinging to him for safety. She was standing beside him, ready to face it. She didn't know what it meant to kill, not truly, but she knew what it meant to stand ground. And somehow, that gave him strength. The fire gave a sharp crack, sending sparks into the air. Outside, the sound of footsteps grew louder. They were moving closer now, no longer hiding. It was the sound of men who had already decided how the night would end. The cowboy rose slowly, his tall frame outlined against the dying fire. The girl looked up at him, her eyes wide but steady. He adjusted his hat low over his brow, rifle raised, body coiled tight. "Stay behind me," he said. She nodded once, though he could tell she didn't like it. The first figure appeared at the mouth of the cave, a shadow shifting against the faint glow. The cowboy lined his sights but didn't fire. Another figure appeared to the side, then another crouched lower, rifles glinting faintly in the half-light. The cave mouth was filling with silhouettes, silent but sure. Like wolves testing the herd dot, the cowboy's breath slowed again, his heart steady despite the storm building around him. He knew what came next. He could almost feel the weight of the bullet that would start it all, the thunder that would follow. His finger tightened. Then, before he could pull the trigger, a voice cut through the dark. Harsh, mocking, certain. You can't hide in there forever, old man. Bring her out and maybe we'll let you keep your skin. The words echoed in the cave and the girl stiffened. She turned her head toward the cowboy, her lips parting as if to speak, but no sound came. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the shadows outside, his mind racing. Whoever they were, they wanted her. More than they wanted him. The cowboy's chest burned with the weight of it. If he gave her up, maybe he could walk away. But the thought sickened him. He wasn't that man anymore, or at least he wanted to believe he wasn't. He had spent too many years walking away, too many years leaving others to pay the price. Not tonight. The silence after the voice stretched long, broken only by the hiss of the dying fire. The cowboy finally called back, his voice low and steady. You'll have to come in and take her. The answer was laughter, sharp and cold, followed by the cocking of rifles. Shadows shifted again, spreading wider around the mouth of the cave. The girl pressed closer to the stone, her hand brushing his sleeve, a silent gesture that carried more than words. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't begging. She was steadying him just as much as he was steadying her. The cowboy set his jaw, the weight of the rifle firm in his hands. The men outside were ready, the circle tight, the tension stretched to breaking. The air felt thick enough to choke. Every nerve in his body screamed that the storm was about to break, that the first spark would set the night ablaze. He drew in one slow breath, eyes locked on the shifting shadows at the cave mouth. The girl's hand lingered against his arm, her presence sharp and real in that moment. Outside, the men closed in, boots scraping, rifles raised, their voices cutting through the dark with threats and jeers. The cowboy's finger pressed against the trigger, every muscle drawn tight, ready for the fight that was about to come. He knew once it started there would be no turning back, no mercy, no pause. The night itself seemed to hold still, the fire whispering low, the shadows crowding in, and in that breathless silence, with danger coiled around them on all sides, the story of their lives drew toward its breaking point, the clash that would decide everything yet to come. The cave shook, with the sound of rifles as the first shots thundered through the dark. The cowboy fired once, the recoil biting into his shoulder, and a shadow at the mouth of the cave collapsed with a cry. The girl pressed close to the wall, covering her ears as sparks lit from stone where bullets struck. Smoke filled the cave, choking the air, the roar of gunfire blending with the echo of boots rushing closer. The cowboy stayed steady, his every movement measured, each shot deliberate. He had been here too many times before, knew the rhythm of a fight like this. But even with his aim true, there were too many of them. For every man that fell, another crept closer, their shouts carrying over the rifle fire. He grit his teeth and reloaded, the metallic click sharp against the chaos. The girl pulled a small knife from her boot, her hand trembling but her grip firm. She crouched beside him, her voice low but steady despite the fear in her eyes. They're not going to stop. They want me. The cowboy didn't look at her, but her words struck hard. He fired again, dropping another shadow, then leaned closer, his voice rough. Why? Tell me now. She hesitated, her face pale in the fading firelight. They're bounty hunters, she admitted at last. Not just after you. They've been paid to bring me back. The words cut through him like a blade. Back to who? He demanded. Her jaw tightened, and she forced the truth out. A man who claims to be my kin. But he's not. He wants what I carry. My father left me papers, land, rights, money. More than men like him could ever earn. They think if they take me, they can take all of it. The pieces fell into place, sharper than any bullet. This wasn't just his past catching up. It was hers. And it meant she was carrying more than stubborn pride. She was carrying the kind of secret men would kill for. The fight outside grew louder, the hunters pressing harder. The cowboy reloaded once more and took his position, his mind set. He wasn't fighting for himself now. He was fighting for her. "Stay low," he ordered, his voice a steel edge. "If they get past me, you run. Don't look back." But she shook her head fiercely, her grip on the knife firm. "I'm not leaving you." He didn't argue. There wasn't time. The next wave of attackers charged, rifles flashing, boots pounding. The cowboy met them with a storm of fire, his aim unshaken even as bullets ripped into the cave walls, sending shards of rock flying. One shot grazed his arm, hot pain lancing through muscle, but he ignored it, his focus sharp. The girl ducked low, striking out with her knife when a man lunged too close, her blade catching his sleeve and forcing him back. She trembled, but she did not break. The fight dragged long, the night seeming endless. Bodies fell, shouts turned to curses, curses to silence. At last, the gunfire slowed, the shadows retreating. The cowboy lowered his rifle, his breath heavy, his body aching with fatigue. The girl leaned against the wall, her knife still clutched tight, her chest heaving. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the crackle of the dying fire and the wind that carried the scent of blood and smoke. Then came the sound of hooves, distant at first, then closer. The cowboy stiffened, raising his rifle again, but when the riders emerged into the faint light of dawn, he saw they weren't hunters. They were townsfolk drawn by the noise, rifles and lanterns in hand. The hunters who remained fled at the sight, their courage draining with the coming day. The cowboy let out a slow breath, lowering his weapon at last. The girl sank down onto the stone floor, her knife slipping from her hand as exhaustion claimed her. He crouched beside her, his rough voice softer now. "You did good." She looked up at him, her eyes shining not with pride, but with relief. "We're alive," she whispered. The townsfolk helped them from the cave, the morning sun casting long shadows across the land. The cowboy's arm throbbed with pain, but he stayed on his feet, steady as ever. The girl walked beside him, her steps slow but unbroken. Together they made their way back toward the town, the weight of the night heavy on their shoulders. By the time they reached the outskirts, the girl had told him more. About her father, about the land that was rightfully hers, about the man who would do anything to take it. The cowboy listened, silent as she spoke, his face unreadable. When she finished, she looked at him, her eyes searching. "You'll leave now, won't you?" He stopped walking, turning his gaze out toward the horizon. The sun rose over the hills, painting the land in gold. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he answered, his voice low. "I've been running all my life. Maybe it's time I stopped," she frowned, not fully understanding. "Why?" He looked at her then, his eyes steady, carrying the weight of years. "Because you're right. They weren't just after me. And a girl can't stand alone against wolves dressed as men. Not yet." Her chin lifted stubbornly, but he saw the gratitude in her eyes. She nodded once, a quiet promise passing between them. In town, the sheriff listened to their story, his expression grim. He warned them that more men would come, men who wouldn't give up so easy. The cowboy already knew it. The girl knew it too. But now they weren't just running. They had a place to stand, a reason to fight. As the day stretched on, the townsfolk offered food, bandages, a place to rest. The cowboy sat on the porch of the saloon, his rifle leaning against the wall, the weight of the night still heavy on his shoulders. The girl sat beside him, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Neither spoke much, but the silence between them wasn't empty. It carried something unspoken, a bond forged in fire and fear. When evening came, the cowboy rose, his shadow long in the fading light. "You'll need someone to teach you," he said. nodding toward the knife at her side. A blade won't be enough when they come again. She met his eyes, determination in her voice. Then teach me. He studied her for a long moment, then gave a short nod. For the first time in years, a flicker of purpose stirred in his chest. Something more than survival. The days that followed brought uneasy peace. The hunters had scattered, but word traveled fast and more would surely come. The girl began to train, her small hands learning the weight of a rifle, the strength of stance, the calm needed to face danger. The cowboy guided her, patient but firm, his voice carrying the lessons he had learned through a lifetime of mistakes. She stumbled, but she never quit. Each day she grew steadier, her pride tempered by resolve. And through it all, the bond between them deepened. He had thought himself long past caring, long past standing for anyone but himself. But each time he saw her rise after a fall, each time he heard her voice steady when fear pressed close, he felt a piece of himself he thought lost return. The conflict that brought them together wasn't gone. It lingered on the horizon, a storm not yet broken. But they no longer faced it alone. They were no longer just a weary cowboy and a girl with secrets. They were something more, two souls bound by survival, by purpose, by the choice to fight when running was no longer enough. As the sun dipped low one evening, painting the town in red and gold, the cowboy looked out across the wide land stretching endless before them. He thought of the battles still to come, of the dangers waiting just beyond sight. But for the first time in years, he also thought of tomorrow. Not just today. The girl stood beside him, her rifle resting in her arms, her gaze strong and sure. She was no longer the frightened figure from that night in the saloon. She was becoming something new, forged in struggle, standing tall. The cowboy tipped his hat low, his voice quiet but steady. "You're not a little girl anymore." She looked at him, a faint smile breaking through her steady gaze. "I never was," she said. The words lingered in the air, carried by the wind, a promise of what was to come. And as the last light of day faded, the cowboy and the girl stood side by side, ready for whatever the frontier would throw their way. The past had chased them, the night had tested them, but the dawn belonged to them now. And in that dawn lay the truth both had come to understand, that survival meant more than running, and strength meant more than standing alone. Together, they had found something worth fighting for. And for the first time in a long while, the old cowboy didn't feel the weight of regret pressing down. He felt hope. Top of form, bottom of form.